Have you ever heard this sound, lube-dub, lube-dub? Yes, this is the sound of the heart beating, which we call the heartbeat or the cardiac cycle. Normally, a human heart beats 72 times per minute, meaning that with each heartbeat, one cardiac cycle is completed. So, 72 cardiac cycles are completed in 1 minute. In this cardiac cycle, several events take place. With every heartbeat, certain events occur. We divide these events into phases. In each cycle, the human heart pumps blood to the entire body, supplying oxygen and nutrients to every part. Now, let's begin with the cardiac cycle. But before we dive into the cardiac cycle, it's important to understand its physiology. So first, let's look at the physiology of the cardiac cycle. The image you see in front of you is of a human heart. You can see that it has 4 chambers, 2 upper chambers and 2 lower chambers. This chamber is called the right atrium, and this chamber is called left atrium. And here are 2 lower chambers. This one is called the right ventricle, and this one is known as the left ventricle. Now, let's understand the functions of these ventricles and their roles. The right ventricle's job is to pump deoxygenated blood to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries. Now, you might be thinking, why does this blood go to the lungs? Because it doesn't contain oxygen, which is why we call it deoxygenated blood. When we breathe, oxygen enters the lungs and oxygenates this blood, turning it into oxygenated blood. So, the function of the right ventricle is to pump deoxygenated blood to the lungs for oxygenation. Now, let's study the function of the left ventricle. As mentioned earlier, after the blood becomes oxygenated, it is carried by the aorta to the rest of the body. The left ventricle's job is to pump this oxygenated blood through the aorta to the entire body. Now let's move on to the phases of the cardiac cycle. There are 2 phases in the cardiac cycle, diastole and systole. The diastolic phase is known as the relaxation phase, and the systolic phase is known as the contraction phase. When the human heart contracts, this is called the systolic phase. On the other hand, when the heart relaxes, it is called the diastolic phase. We are going to study both phases one by one. Let's start with the diastolic phase. During this phase, the heart muscles relax. As soon as the muscles relax, blood flows through the veins and fills the atria, entering both the right and left atria. When blood fills the atria, the mitral valve and tricuspid valve open as seen in the image. As soon as these valves open, blood flows from the atria into the ventricles. Now, we move to the second phase, which is the systolic phase. During this phase, the ventricles contract. As soon as the ventricles contract, the blood is pushed out of the heart into the arteries. Additionally, what happens here is that the mitral valve and tricuspid valve, which opened during the diastolic phase, now close during the systolic phase. This prevents blood from flowing back into the atria. At the same time, the other 2 valves, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, open. When they open, blood flows into the pulmonary artery and the aorta. After this, the ventricles relax, marking the end of the systolic phase and the completion of the cardiac cycle. In other words, with every heartbeat, one cardiac cycle is completed, which consists of both systolic and diastolic phases. If we summarize the cardiac cycle, it goes like this. First, the heart relaxes. As soon as the heart relaxes, blood from the superior and inferior vena cava enters the right atrium. Once the blood enters the right atrium, it passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood moves through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery. This blood, traveling through the pulmonary artery, goes to the lungs for oxygenation. Initially, this was deoxygenated blood. Now, once oxygenated, it returns to the heart through the pulmonary veins and enters the left atrium. When the blood enters the left atrium, it moves through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. After reaching the left ventricle, It flows through the aortic valve into the aorta, from where it is supplied to the entire body. This blood supplies the body with glucose, nutrients, and oxygen. So, this is the complete cardiac cycle. Now, today's question is, what is the contraction phase of the cardiac cycle called? If you know the answer, please comment below. If you're interested in more of my lectures, such as on the lungs, kidneys, liver, brain, or eyes, you can visit my channel and watch them. And if you like my video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.